All right, so we are going to start. So hopefully everything's viewable now. I forgot on the slides, I meant to have them published. They look like they're published on the homepage, and I had to have it on the files tab as well. To be able to open those up, we'll be working through kind of module for skeleton slides. At the end of class, I might go over something that we didn't cover last week at the very end. We've got time to do it. That was the last question I put in the quiz that was worth 0 points. So I just want to review that, make sure we have covered that today. We do an in-class quiz later. The other things that we have. So what we do last night, module 2 quiz, module 3 reading. It's going to be the same every single week. So after Thursday's class, what'll pop up? The module 3 quiz and the module 4 reading. All right. So we also have, before those pop up, maybe the next couple of days, that might be a good time to get this pack back assignment done. Right. So this is where I had this post with different articles, different prompts, questions you can think about. You'll kind of post your initial response, or you'll hit this big red ask a new question button. This is where it calls them questions. It's really just you're responding kind of these articles, what I wrote about them, and you're trying to end these statements or put questions in these, what you're writing, so that other people can then kind of respond to that. So you might say what your thoughts are on the topic, but what if this happened, right? Or I think that it would play out this way. What if all of a sudden, ChatGPT is, made illegal or something like that, right? Like, I don't know, throw in kind of some additional questions throughout what you're writing so that it's easier for then people to respond to your response, because you have to post your initial question or your initial response and then respond to 2 other individuals, all right? So kind of keeping this as like an open-ended, or kind of keeping this as a discussion is going to be how I'm trying to have you do this. So it's kind of be a back and forth in between what you post and then people responding to you. Okay. So that's not due until the end of next week. So you've got a lot of time, especially for this first one, to get on. Make sure you can get the pack back working. Make sure you can get on. I would try to get that out of the way earlier rather than later, because we're going to get further removed. It's kind of more related to the material we covered last week. Maybe a little bit of what we talked about this week you can kind of use. For the most part, thinking about what we were talking about last week. Okay. Other than that, I think that should be it for the house. Any questions for me? We're jumping. Oh, I also wanted to mention, I think CL sessions, from what I heard, went pretty well. Couple things. I talked with some of the leaders, maybe to kind of iron out some things that maybe didn't go as I exactly had wanted them to for next week. But I think they should have a slightly more detailed description of exactly how I want to have them host those CL sessions. It's primarily to answer your questions and work through the problems that you have over these sets of practice problems that I put up on Canvas. So similar, you'll have the practice problems for this week. I think I gave you quite a bit more this week. I think there might be 20 in there. Every quiz is only going to be 12. So there's a lot of material you can kind of go through this week. They probably might not have time to go through all 20. So I always tell them to ask you first, what questions do you want to see work through first to make those CL sessions the most efficient? I think that based off the numbers I got, about 200 of you went. So it's about, not of you, there's 2 sections. So 2 out of 600, it's pretty good. So usually there's some attrition as we move forward. But there was still available slots in every time slot. So whatever works for you this week, this Thursday, Sunday, feel free to go to those. I had some people reaching out about they didn't know where they were at. I mentioned this in class, but there's a summary file under the files tab that has kind of what locations are available at different days and times. It's also in the syllabus that I updated. So if you download the syllabus week 1, this is where I didn't have the confirmation on the rooms. Once I did, I updated it. So if you now access it on Canvas, you kind of have those locations there as well. Okay. But other than that, I think that should do it for housekeeping stuff. If there's no other questions, we'll jump into material. Good. Okay. So we have a lot of material to get through this week. So I'll try to set us up pretty good today. We'll probably move a little bit quicker on Thursday. Okay. So we're going to start out thinking about, last week we were kind of looking more like an entire economy. here we're going to try to focus on markets. So this is going to be the market for one specific good. So the market for Sharpie markers, the market for Nike shoes, like not Nike shoes, but just tennis shoes in general. We're thinking about looking at one product. Now, we're going to be looking at what we call competitive market. This won't really matter much for us initially. Eventually, we'll talk about what non-competitive markets look like. But for now, we're just going to assume that in any market, we've got a bunch of people who want to buy this product and a bunch of companies or people that are selling. So there's a bunch of consumers and a bunch of producers. So buyers, sellers, we also call that consumers and producers of a good. Okay. So a perfectly competitive market is going to be one in which no buyer or seller has any influence over the price. So what violates this? Maybe a game that you've all played. There's only one seller. You own all the properties, monopoly, right? That would break this, right? So we're thinking about markets where if I wanted to buy this product, there's several companies I could buy it from. And if the companies are selling it, there's several people who want to buy it from them, right? So that's kind of our perfectly competitive markets. We're going to use this assumption that that's the market we're looking at. We'll talk last third of the class what non-perfectly competitive markets look like, okay? So the first thing we're going to kind of hone in on is consumers, right? Today, we're really going to focus on consumers. Who is buying this product, right? So we would call the desire, or we'll end up eventually phrasing as the ability and willingness to pay. That's going to be our demand, right? Consumers are demanding this product. They want to buy it. Okay? So the quantity demanded is going to be that, okay, for the same product, if I change the price, people are going to want to buy more or less of it, right? So you think about if I go to the store, I don't know, and I see that, well, I'll give you an example of what I did this past week, that they're running, like I have a sale, right, on chicken wings, right? What might I do? Well, I was only going to get one pack before, maybe now I get two, right? My quantity demanded, when the price was lower, what happened to the quantity demanded? I wanted to buy more, right? Maybe I bought a bunch more and froze it or something like that, right? And so we have this idea that with quantity demanded, the law of demand tells us that the price and the quantity are going to be moving in opposite directions. That when the price of a good goes up, I'm going to want to buy less of it. And then when the price of a good goes down, I'm going to want to buy more of it. Hopefully this is not like a wild revelation, right? It seems pretty intuitive, right? So the law of demand tells us that we have this inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, okay? And I'll use arrows sometimes to kind of, when I'm like shorthanding this, I'll usually draw arrows to mean like increases and decreases. So for now, we're going to assume this relationship is linear, makes the math easier for us. If you like continue to take econ courses and went to like intermediate micro, we'll then start to talk about more complicated functions. But for us, keeping everything linear. So what's going to be driving this law of demand? Well, we'll kind of talk about a little bit later on, things that shift the demand curve. But this actual relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, as the price of something goes up, right? So let me think of a good example here. Well, you think about the product, the two very similar goods, but if the price of electric vehicles starts to go down, right? What do you think happens to the quantity demanded for gasoline-powered vehicles? So if all of a sudden electric vehicles become cheaper and cheaper, people are going to be more likely to buy an electric vehicle and less likely to buy a gasoline-powered vehicle. So as the price of electric vehicles decreases, okay, I'm substituting away from other products. Okay? So the substitution effect, the fact that when a company or someone lowers the price of their product, I'm not buying other things. I substitute away and start to buy more of their product. Or said differently, when they increase the price, I stop buying their product and I start to buy more of someone else's. This might be if Nike increases the price of their shoe by $100, I start to buy less Nikes, substitute away towards other companies, other brands. Now the income effect is also going to drive this relationship because even if I want to spend, let's say I don't know, I want to spend all of my money for whatever reason on bottles of water. This is a stupid example, but let's say I've got $100 in my pocket and I want to buy bottles of water. Each one costs $1. How many can I buy? 100. Well, what happens if they increase the price to 2? I might still want to buy 100, but if I only have $100 and now the price of a bottle of water is $2, how many can I buy? So when the price went up, what happened? I had to buy less. My quantity demand went down. So the income and substitution effect are both going to kind of push this relationship to be that when the price of something goes up, people buy or demand less of it. So what is that going to look like? We'll first start out thinking about numerically, and then we'll kind of put a nice visual. But this would be that, I got some dumb example here with orange mocha frappuccinos, right? That as the price is going up, right? How much is this one person willing to buy? Well, this kind of goes to make a good point. Even if the price of something is 0, right? It may be that I don't just buy an infinite amount of it, right? I don't want an infinite amount. For example, if you told me that bottles of water are free completely, well, I mean, I might fill up part of my garage, but I'm not going to fill up my entire house, right? So there is some limit, even when the price is 0, of how much I want of that product, right? So my quantity demanded will start out pretty high when the price is 0. And then as the price increases, because of this substitution income effect, I'm going to demand, or I want to buy less and less of that product. Now, eventually the price gets so high that even to have one of those drinks, in this example, I'm like, yeah, I'm not willing to pay that much. I like these frappuccinos, but not enough to pay $6, right? So here's kind of the different quantities that someone would be willing to purchase at various prices. As those prices go up, they're willing to buy, or the quantity demanded is going down. Okay, this is kind of following our law of demand. Okay? Any questions on this? This isn't be too crazy. So I think I'll skip ahead here if I can. There we go. So we can then take this demand schedule and put it into kind of graph form, right? Because if I think about my prices as my Y variable and quantity demanded as my X variable, I really just have combinations of X and Y. I can plot these points, right? So, excuse me, I plot that first point. We're at a price of 0. Quantity demanded was 12 of these drinks, these frappuccinos. At $1, 10. At $2, 8. So on and so forth. I said we're always going to keep demand linear. So really, technically, you could have just found I need 2 points and then drew a line, right? But really, that demand curve is telling me all the different possible combinations of if the price of this good was this, here's the quantity demand. Right? So at $2, the quantity demand was 8. At $4, the quantity demand was 4, so on and so forth. So we can take a demand schedule and make that into a demand curve. So I just want to kind of point this out. I might have this in a future slide, but I think it's worth doing here. So let's say, I'll draw a small one down here first. So we were looking at the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, and we were saying that was going to be our demand curve. Okay. Well, if I was just to kind of draw a general relationship like this between any two variables, in math, how would you write that equation? Y is equal to, I think they're still using this, mx plus b, right? What does b represent? Your y-intercept. What does m represent? Your slope. We're doing the same thing. We're just using price and quantity. So for us, we're going to write out our y variable of price. Right? And it doesn't matter what variables we use here. Generally, the format I'll use, I just put the intercept in here first. And then here's my slope, is this whatever value b we have. And then my x value is the quantity demanded. Okay. Same thing, right? Just different notation. Okay. So we got this nice linear demand curve. What is always going to be true about our slope here? So as X increases, what's happening to the Y value? It's decreasing, right? This is the idea that in order to convince someone to buy more, I have to lower the price. So our slope is always going to be, for a demand curve, less than 0 or negative. So we've got this negative or downward sloping demand curve, right? Kind of follows this general equation. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah. Yep. Just like you would take slope and just multiply it by whatever your X variable is. Our X variable is just the quantity demanded. Yep. So I think in my example here, so if we go back those slides, the price at which the quantity demanded was 0 was $6, right? So when quantity demanded was 0, right, what was my corresponding price? It would just be whatever the intercept was. So there, the price at which we had a quantity demand of 0 was 6. So that would be my intercept. Okay. Now, I also had that if I went from a price of 6 to 5, my quantity demanded went from 0 to kind of 2 here. So if I wanted to find this slope, how do I calculate a slope? Change in Y over the change in X. What's on my Y-axis? Price. What's on my X-axis? Quantity demanded. If I'm going from this point of 6, 0 to 5, 2, what's the change in Y? -1. What's my change in X? So my slope here would be -1/2. Right? So you still can calculate slopes, right? It's just what's on our X and Y axis looks a little bit different than like our production possibilities curve, right? Now we're looking at the different prices and quantity demanded combinations. Okay. Any other questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah. Here, what does B represent? Just the slope, right? So this is going to be kind of the relationship that exists between what does the price decrease have to be in order for me to convince this consumer to buy one more of this product. Right? So basically, we said it's -1/2. That would mean if I decrease the price by 50 cents, so if I went from like 6 to 5.50, they're now going to buy one more of the product. Right? That's what that slope is telling me. If I decrease the price another 50 cents, now they'll buy one more, and so on and so forth. Okay. Yes. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So we have our demand curve. I think I've already said all this, right? We talked about, that intercept is going to be the price at which essentially we would demand 0. The slope we can find by looking at really any 2 points we wanted to on that demand curve. We're just taking the change in our Y over the change in X. So as long as I have 2 points on that demand curve, I can figure out what the slope is. Now we said the slope is always going to be negative, right? So why is it always going to be negative? Well, we think about what this demand curve is telling us. It's telling us about the ability and willingness of that consumer to pay that specific price. So it's another way of thinking about this. Kind of use the extremes. So let's say I have that demand curve where it started out at 6. Okay. The very first, so we had our equation. We said the intercept was 6, slope was -1/2. Okay. So where or what price test. Okay. Well, we're back. All right. So what price would this person be willing to pay for that very first unit? Well, if I plug in that first unit, a quantity of 1, what value or what price do I get here? 550. So the very first unit will be purchased when the price falls to 550. So let's think about what that means. I would choose to buy something as long as what? The marginal benefit is greater than or equal to what from last week? Marginal cost. What is the marginal cost when you buy something? If I buy a pack of cigarettes, the marginal cost is the price, right? Whatever money I have to hand over to get you that good. So my price is essentially the marginal cost. So if the price is anywhere between $6 and $5.51, that marginal cost is actually greater than the price at which, or the marginal benefit of that very first unit. I know that someone's not going to buy that first unit until the price falls to 550. What's the first price at which the person will choose to buy this? As soon as that price is equal to their marginal benefit. So once that price falls and it hits 550, now they're willing to buy that first unit. Well, now, what if I wanted to get my consumer? What if I said, okay, I'm selling this person 1. What if I want them to buy 2? Well, as I have more of something, what happens to the marginal benefit? It's decreasing. So how much would they be willing to pay for the second unit? Well, the price at which they would buy 2 would be 5, right? So if I keep charging the price of 550, are they going to buy that second? No. I'd have to lower the price a little bit more. So really what this price is telling me, so if I've ever got kind of my general form of this equation where we said we know that our slope here is negative, the price really is telling me the marginal benefit of these different quantities. So the marginal benefit of the first quantity was 550 because that was the first price at which they're willing to buy the good. It would have to be the first price that is equal to their marginal benefit. To buy that second unit, they're not willing to buy it until the price falls to exactly 5. That's the first price that would be equal to their marginal benefit. And then we could kind of go on, so on and so forth. We could do quantities of 3, 4, 5, 6. That price from our demand curve equation really is telling us the marginal benefit, right? So the demand curve reflects to us the marginal benefit of the consumer, right? At each one of these quantities, whatever that corresponding price is, that must be exactly what the marginal benefit of that consumer was. Is that any questions on that idea? Yeah. Say again. So we're thinking about when they choose to buy that second unit, it will have to be the first price that I'd be willing to buy it is as soon as that price is equal to the marginal benefit. So my demand curve reflects that these are the various prices that would be exactly equal to my marginal benefit of these different quantities. Yes. So that's why I would write like demand is really reflecting to us the marginal benefits of these different quantities. Yep. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So So we kind of already went through the first two, but I could do this for the third. I would plug in the quantity of 3. And what I see is that my marginal benefit, right? In our example, it started out, it was 550, then it was 5. If I plug in 3 there, it becomes 450. My marginal benefit is declining. So another aspect of the demand curve actually represents marginal benefits. What's true about my demand curve? It was downward sloping. So just like last week, we said when we have more of something, when we buy more of it, the marginal benefit is decreasing. This was I always use cars as the example because that's like a dramatic decrease going from 0 to 1, huge marginal benefit, 1 to 2, much lower. Same thing kind of here, right? Our marginal benefit is decreasing. Okay. Let me think if there's any questions on this idea. Kind of already hit this, but the next thing that we'll talk about, right? Everything I've been drawing out here and kind of the way I'm trying to phrase it is through the lens of like an individual. But I started out saying we're not looking at an economy, we're looking at individual markets, right? I don't want to just know how your consumer habits are. I want to know on average, what is the entire economy's consumer habits for this one product? So how do I go from individual to market demand? Well, it's pretty easy. So if I had 2 individuals in my economy, okay, how would I get market demand? So if I think that at these different prices, I could draw out Zoolander's demand curve and Ken's demand curve. If I want market demand, if I know that at $5, Zoolander will buy 2, Ken will buy 6. In the market, if I charge $5, how many will be bought? 8. I'm not trying to trick you here, right? So all we would do is at every single price, I would just add up every individual's demand, right? Or quantity demanded. Now here I have 2 individuals, so it's not that difficult. But to get my market demand, I would just look at every price. What's the total demand, right? Adding up the demand from each individual in my economy to get my market demand. And add the next price. I would add that up, then the next price, so on and so forth. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. We're good. All right. I don't think this is too crazy. Now it gets a little bit weird. So I wanted to ask a couple questions here. So who is going to have a higher intercept in this example? So remember, the intercept would represent the price where the person would buy nothing, right? So who's going to have a higher intercept in terms of their demand curve? So Zoolander, the price at which they'll buy nothing is 6. What about Ken? Do we even know it? No, but we know that it has to be higher than 6. Now, I think about the slope of the demand curve. Who's going to have who's going to have a steeper slope here? Right? So this gets kind of tricky. I might want to draw this out and plot it. But notice my change in Y is always going to be the price. So as price is going up by $1, what's the change in the quantity demanded for Zoolander? 2. So my same example we had before, that slope is going to be negative 1/2. Right? Change in the price, those are my y-axis, change in quantity demanded on the x-axis. What about Ken? There the slope is going to be change in price is 1, change in quantity demanded is 1, so -1. So Ken is going to have a slightly steeper demand curve, right? -1 will be the slope as opposed to -1/2. Okay. But if it helps, you could plot these out, kind of draw it out, kind of to kind of think about this. Okay. All right. Any questions? Yeah.
That if your intercept is higher than your slope is going to be steeper and they don't have to work.
Not necessarily, right? I could do a different example where, yeah, I could start one out with a lower intercept, but a flatter slope, right? It could be any combination. Yep. It won't, I'm not probably going to ask you a ton of questions for that. I'm just trying to tackle some of these things we mentioned. The real thing I want to focus on here is how do I get market demand? It's just adding up every individual's demand curve at every specific price. Okay. So, oh, do I not hear it? So I took these numbers and I just said, it's basically like plotting out an individual demand curve to get plot our market demand curve. I'm gonna do something else here as well that I think will kind of kill two birds with one stone for something we're going to talk about later. But let's say I was in that example and we said, what did I say? Zoolander had a lower intercept and I think it was flatter, right? So something like this, right? And then here, something like this. So this was like Zoolander's demand curve. Here was Ken's. How am I coming up with my market demand curve? I'm just going through and at every price, I'm adding up the quantity demanded of each individual. So I know that my market demand is going to be up here. And then at this price, my market demand is going to be over here, right? So my market demand curve is always just adding up my individual demand curve. Okay? If I were to add more individuals to this economy, what's going to happen to my market demand? So let's say I add in a third individual. Where's market demand going to be now? It's not just this plus this. It would be this plus this plus this, right? So my market demand, as I add more individuals into my economy, is going to shift which direction? Well, here I was adding these two values up and I was here. If I add all three of these values up, I'm going to be even further to the right, right? So as I add more people to my economy, so this was kind of like our 3-person economy, my demand curve is going to look like it's shifting to the right, or if I have more individuals, just intuitively, is my market demand going to be higher or lower? Higher. If I have 100 million people in my economy versus 2, is market demand for my product going to be higher or lower? Higher, right? So as we add in more of these individuals, we're just adding up more individual demand curves to get market demand. Market demand is going to shift further and further to the right. So this is where I'll start to use the terminology of when we think about increases in demand, right? Demand is higher. I try not to use higher, lower. I accidentally do sometimes, but I definitely won't talk about upward or downward shifts because it gets confusing once we get to supply. So anytime we're talking about increases in demand, we're going to think about this as and I draw the arrow, a rightward shift. Or think about it as I'm moving further from this 0 point. I'm increasing demand. If I were ever to see like, I don't know, demand decrease, right? This would be a leftward shift. And I'll go over kind of increases, decreases here in a second. But I just want to kind of introduce it with the idea of the fact that to get market demand, we're just adding up every individual's demand curve. I think there's anything else I want to say here. I get a lot of questions last class about like what happens to the slope. We're not going to dive into that into this class. It gets tricky. But ultimately we don't really care too much about what happens to the slope as you know, or what the slope is. We can always find market demand and then we can worry about what its slope is. In terms of like me asking you, here's 4 individuals, here's all their slope. What will the market demand slope be? I'm not going to ask you to do that, right? I might ask you, if there's these 4 individuals, here's each individual quantity demanded, what is overall market demand? We just know that every price would just be adding up what each individual's quantity demand would be. Yeah.
Why is it ever important to know the slope of the individual?
Why is it ever important? Well, I would want to know what the slope of my market demand curve looks like, because if I'm a company and I'm thinking about setting prices, I want to know how my consumers are going to respond, right? So I want to know like if it's really, really flat, that means that if I change the price a little bit, they're going to buy a lot less. So I am worried about the slope. We'll talk a little bit more about slope and elasticity next week. But yeah, for now, we'll kind of punt on the whole slope thing. We'll kind of not talk about that until next week, but that's why they would be concerned with it. Yeah. All right. you're thinking about it, kind of looking at it like vertically.
Yeah.
So you want to think about this as kind of where market demand is, as being kind of this horizontal, right? I understand what you're saying in terms of the price. I'm not drawing these technically correct. I should be like drawing them technically. So we're going to talk about shifts later. I'm never going to ask you about intercepts, but you're right. Technically, the slope will be changing here. Any shifts that we draw, we're always going to draw parallel shifts. I was just kind of setting this up as like how do we start to think about shifts? But you're right. Technically, these won't be parallel shifts. All these curves would like start out at whatever the highest consumer was, and then that's where the slopes start to change. But we're not going to focus on shifts. We're just thinking about these. Anytime we talk about increases or decreases in demand, we're just going to be thinking about parallel shifts, right? But yes, you're right. Technically, they would all have to start out at what point? The consumer who's willing to pay the highest for that first unit. Yep. I won't ask you questions about that though. So, but good point. Okay. All right. So jump the gun a little bit there, but I think it's worthwhile. Whoops. So here is our market demand. I kind of already alluded to this already, but we're going to have things that change other than the price of a good that are then going to influence not just like quantity demanded. We're not going to move to different points on the demand curve. So when we change the price of a good, that would, we're moving to different quantity demanded points on the same demand curve. Here, other things can change that at every single price will influence demand, right? So we already kind of talked about the number of consumers already. I'll walk through a different example, and I've got some drawings here, but I'm just going to like piece them together and show you maybe more what I'm thinking about. So let's say I've got price and quantity. And instead of like old and new, sometimes I'll just use numbers. So like 1 is where the first demand curve, then something changes. Where's the second demand curve? So I would call that like D2. Right? So let's say this is my original demand curve. And let's say that I have more income. Okay. So if I have an increase in income, this was the idea that part of this demand curve is being driven by the income effect. Even if the price of a bottle of water stays the same, if I have more money in my pocket, if I'm only buying a bottle of water, I can now afford to buy more, right? So increases in income for most normal goods, I use this term normal, what's going to happen to our demand curve? No matter what price we're looking at, when people have more income, generally they're going to buy more. Seeing some people mouth it, right? So this would be what we kind of call normal goods. So that would be at every price, they're willing to buy more of this product, or we get this rightward shift in our demand curve. Okay. Now, if I ever had a decrease in income, for normal goods, if I have less income, what's that going to do to my demand? If I don't have as much money, even if the price is the same, I can now afford to buy less. And that's true at every single price, right? So for normal goods, right, it kind of works very similar to where if we just have more people in our economy. So if I have more people in my economy, or we saw like an increase in the number of consumers, or I have more income, for normal goods, that's going to increase demand, right? Or shift demand to the right. So rightward shifts are what we're going to represent increases. Like I said, we're not going to use upward and downward. Once we get the supply, I think it'll make a little bit more sense. But for the sake of right now, just trust me, it'll make things easier down the road. Rightward shifts are increases in demand. Leftward shifts would represent decreases in demand. Okay. So for normal goods, income and demand kind of move in the same direction. When we have more income, demand increases. We have decrease in income, demand decrease. So this is like, for most products, during economic downturns, what do we see happen to the demand for most products? Well, economic downturns, people have less money, so demand would decrease. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. So I have kind of in the slides, whoops, something that looks similar to this. Just instead of like D1, D2, I wrote old, new. So here we've got like decreases and increases in demand. What might also cause these? So if I have more people in my economy, that means I'm going to have more individual demand curves that I'm adding up. What's going to happen to my market demand? We said it's going to, I'm adding up more people at each price, my market quantity demanded will be further to the right or an increase, right? So more people, more income, increases in demand. Now, why might the US be really concerned with its growth rate or its birth rate right now? Like less than 2, which if it's exactly 2, that means we're replacing ourselves exactly. If it's less than 2, that means population is going down. If I have fewer consumers, what's going to happen to demand for products? I've got fewer individual demand curves. My market demand will be less, right? Or we should see decreases in demand. So what might I do? Try to sell my product to other countries, right? Increase the number of consumers I have for my products. Okay. So number of buyers. This one, we kind of already have really talked through this, right? So if we add more people into our economy, our very easy example where we had market demand for Ken and Zoolander, if I add in Hansel, right? If you don't get the Zoolander references, I pity you. You should go watch this, how it holds up. So we add in more people, what's going to happen to our market demand curve? It just keeps shifting more and more to the right, because at every single price, we just now have more and more people who are willing to buy some of this product. Okay? So we already talked about income. Now I talked about income for normal goods. We also have, so these are most goods we think about: clothing, cars, housing. I put computers on here. Most products we buy are probably normal goods, but we also have inferior goods, right? So, excuse me. What are inferior goods? So this is where the change in income and demand actually work in the opposite directions. Okay. So I put some examples up here. I like public transportation, but I'll I have another example I think is good too. So sometimes I say like ramen noodles, but then inevitably someone in the class will be like, well, I love ramen noodles. I'd buy more if I had more money. Okay. You get what I'm trying to get at here, right? But let's think about public transportation like the bus system. If you have more income, what are you more likely to buy? A car. In which case, when you have more income, what's happening to the quantity demanded you have for public transportation? Decreases. You have more income, and your actual demand for the product decreased. These aren't normal goods, right? Most goods, when I have more money, I'm likely to buy more clothes, right? I'm likely to go from 0 to 1 brand new computers or brand new cars, right? And when people have more money, they tend to go from 0 to 1 home, or then maybe have a vacation, right? You buy more of a product for a normal good. For inferior goods, because we have the substitution effect going on, right? As I have more money, what do I start to do? I substitute away from public transportation towards my own transportation, right? So for some goods, we actually have this inverse relationship, and we would call these inferior goods. Now, the reason why we use inferior, because most of them, another way to think about it's probably like low quality goods. So for example, you know, I don't know. I might buy, so the other example I always like to use is commercial airlines. So commercial flights, as you have more and more money, eventually what do? You substitute away and you fly. Probably not most of us, but Elon Musk is flying private jets. You don't rely on commercial airlines at all, right? Commercial airlines are essentially, in a way, inferior good, right? Initially, they might be for most of us a normal good because none of us get to an income level where we can afford a private jet. But you think about for some individuals, commercial airlines would be an inferior good, right? If I had enough money, if my income increased enough, I'm gonna buy less of this product. Now, I always like ramen noodles, examples like that, like cheap foods that you eat when you don't have a lot of money, that once you have money, you kind of stop eating. So the example I use, just because it was personal to, like, this is just how I live. When I had like no money in college and in grad school, I bought a lot more canned tuna and found weird ways to eat canned tuna. I don't buy there's not any in my house right now. Well, there is, but it's only because we have outdoor cats, right? That's the only way that tuna gets eaten in my house, right? So that good to me, once I had more money, I bought none of, I decreased my demand dramatically. That's an inferior good to me. And this is why, any one product could be an inferior good to some people and not others. But we're talking about on average. That's one of the things in this class, like I might use examples. Obviously, like not everything's going to always apply unanimously to people. Like I'm talking about on average. And I try to use examples that I think make more sense, like public transportation. I think for most people, if you actually want to spend more time on a public bus, you're a psychopath, right? So I think for that example, most of us it lines up with. But I'll sometimes use something to be like, well, it doesn't apply to me specifically. Might not, right? We're talking about on average, is this product an inferior good? Okay. And none of you should know about this one. But maybe in a few years, right? As you have more money, what happens to low quality inferior products like Natty Light or Natty Ice, right? This is a really dirt cheap beer. If you're not aware, that tastes horrible. I don't care what anyone says. As you have more income, what do we see people do? They don't buy Natty Ice. They're buying things from like, Sun King, like better breweries, higher quality kind of products. Same kind of thing, with like liquors. You see that when people have more money, they stop buying bottom shelf, what's the one vodka? It's like Kamchatka or some Russian name that I can't pronounce, right? It's like $8 for a fifth. You stop buying that and you buy something that's a little bit higher quality, right? So even like the same product, we can have normal and inferior goods. Like the lower quality version is often like inferior, higher quality versions are often normal. So this also applies to like branding. If you go to like Walmart, typically we see like great value brand products. People behave like that's an inferior product when they have more income. Whereas like, I don't even know, whatever the brand names are for vegetables that I don't know why people care. But right, those tend to look a little more normal. Now, when people have higher incomes, they tend to gravitate more towards the brand, kind of higher brand names as opposed to like these lower brand names. So there's different examples of the same thing. The other thing I want to make sure we kind of get to is talking about the price of related goods. Okay, so we've got income, we've got the number of consumers. We also have the price of related goods. So I'll kind of set this up with some examples, and I'll use some shorthand here in a second. But let's say I walk into a restaurant and they're charging $2 for Pepsi, for a thing of Pepsi, $4 for a thing of Coke, right? Which one am I going to buy? I mean, unless I have some diehard allegiance to Pepsi, like it's all cola products. It's really all the same. You look at the chemical composition, it's the same shit, right? So if one of them tries to charge a higher price, what do? You substitute away from that product and buy more of the other. It doesn't just have to be two different brands, right? This could be things like, well, what happens as gasoline? So actually here, I'll give you an example. What happens as electric vehicles have become cheaper and cheaper? What do you think happens to the demand for gasoline powered vehicles? So if electric vehicles are becoming more and more affordable, are people going to be more or less likely to buy them? More, which means they buy an electric vehicle, what are they less likely to buy? Gasoline powered vehicle. Right? So anytime we have substitute goods, I can either buy a gas powered car or I can buy an electric powered car. Right? If the price of one of those is decreasing, I'm more likely to buy that good, less likely to buy the other. Okay? So, you can use different brands. The Pepsi Coke works. It's kind of old now because like, how many of you have a desktop computer? Yeah, not many, right? But it used to be like everybody had a desktop because laptops were really expensive. And then as the price of laptops fell, what happened to demand for desktop computers? Well, if laptops are becoming cheaper, are people more or less likely to demand desktop computers? Less likely. So there we've got, just to kind of give you a shorthand. If I can get these unstuck. There we go. So if I've got substitute goods, just in general, if the price of this Y good goes up, that means the demand for the other good that it's a substitute for is actually going to also go up. I was phrasing everything like if electric vehicles become cheaper, then the demand for like gas powered cars goes down, but it works in the opposite direction as well. So for substitute goods, price and the demand, price of the other product and the demand for the product you're looking at, they kind of move in the same direction. Okay. Now, what if instead I have what we call complementary goods? Okay? So we'll kind of do Y here. And so this was like electric vehicles, gasoline powered vehicles. I'm just going to shorthand. You can write it in if you have time. So I'm going to think about a complementary good. I'll use this example. So let's say the price of gas, right? And I'm thinking about huge like gas SUVs, right? They have really low miles per gallon, right? So they kind of use a lot of gas. If the price of gas goes up, what do you think happens to the demand we see for these huge SUVs that require a lot, to have low miles per gallon? People buy less. Well, why? Well, substitute goods, we said these work in the same direction. Why do they work in opposite directions here? Because I use this example because in order to use this good, in order to drive my SUV, what do I need? I need this other product. I have to use these two products together. Now, I can use gas for other things. I could use it to start a fire in the backyard, not like a, but like, you know, still gotta get a fire kind of going. I can use it for, you know, to power my lawnmower, but I definitely need it to use this other good. So it's not that these two goods always have to be used together, but it's that they often are. And in this case, like I need gas to use this product, right? It's a complementary good. Okay. So I like this example because to me, there's no way you can talk around it. Other people will use examples like bagels and cream cheese or peanut butter and jelly. And inevitably someone will be like, well, I don't like cream cheese. Okay, well, you get the example. Like most people put cream cheese on a bagel. So we would kind of call those complementary goods, right? But I think here, this one's like a pretty fail-safe example to have in your mind when we're thinking about complementary goods. Okay, I need gasoline in order to use this gas-powered SUV. Okay? And then said differently, if the price of gas goes down, right? What's going to happen to the demand over here? Right, they work in opposite directions. Okay? And then once again, its demand increases and decreases. We draw those the exact same, rightward and leftward shifts. Okay. Where are we at in time? Okay. I'm going to come back to this in the slides, but I think it's worth doing something here and shorthanding it, and then we'll kind of jump back to the slides. So there's a slide related to complements and substitutes. It basically says what we did here. I'm just kind of putting it in shorthand form. You can make it more lengthy and write out words like increases, but I don't know. I always think this is a nice kind of summary of it. So another thing that we can think about matters are income expectations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'll talk through the intuition. If I think I'm going to have more money tomorrow for normal goods, what do you think happens to the demand today? Increases, right? What do you do right now? Well, you think you're going to have more money once you graduate, so you might take out loans to buy things today, right? You buy more of the normal products today, and maybe you take out those loans so you don't have to buy inferior goods, right? So that's because you expect to have more income in the future. So income expectations work the exact same way as if you actually have more or less income. If I think I might lose my job, I expect to have less income in the future. What might I do today? Try to save, try to buy fewer products today. I'm acting just as though I do have lower income. So that's not crazy. Income expectations work the same way for consumers as income. Now, the one that's a little bit different are price expectations. Okay. So let's think about current demand and my expectations for the price in the future. So let's say I read an article and I think that, I don't know, lithium batteries are going to become a lot cheaper, right? Well, let's not do that. Let's do eggs. I read an article about this. I think eggs are like, for whatever reason, the price is increasing. I don't remember why. I haven't read about it. It's probably some supply chain thing. But let's say we expect that the price of eggs, right, is just going to keep on getting, and this isn't eggs, this is expectations, right? But I expect that the price keeps going up and up. What's going to happen to my current demand? Well, if I think eggs are going to be twice as expensive tomorrow, what do I do today? I go out and buy more of them, right? So this is where if I all of a sudden think that there's going to be a price increase tomorrow, I'll try to avoid that and buy that product today. So this looks like it violates our law of demand. Higher price, and I'm actually buying more. Well, no, because the law of demand talks about the relationship of current prices, right? If we expect future higher prices, that relationship with current demand actually works the exact opposite. Because if I think prices are going to be higher tomorrow, I'm going to want to make sure I buy it today. Also said differently, if I think that there's going to be lower prices, right, tomorrow, then current demand, I'm actually going to buy less today. I'm going to try to hold out, right, as much as I can. Okay? So this is kind of price expectations. The relationship works that, differently than it did for just like the current price and current demand. Does that, any questions on that? Shouldn't be too crazy. Okay. I think there's anything else I want to say here. I think that should cover it. So any questions? I think we talked about complementary goods. We talked about income and price expectations. The last kind of thing I have here is a catch-all category. So this is just going to be something I don't ask you a lot of questions on because it's like stuff that we never really know ahead of time. It's usually like looking back. So I have fidget spinners here. Why those were a thing for a while and people were actually paying money for them, I don't know, right? It's some fad that we have a hard time explaining. Or there was I got pet rocks back in the 70s. There was way before my time. Yeah, pet rocks were a thing for a while, like this novel good that people were actually buying. Atkins diet, right? Different diet fads that kind of come in and out of fashion. They'll like increase or decrease the demand for certain goods that fit that diet. So like the Atkins diet, you got to eat a lot of proteins and fats. So like eggs and bacon, we saw a spike in the 90s when that was a popular diet. These are just things that are going to be hard to anticipate, but do shift the demand, right? Another one that I'll use that's kind of like expectations, but it can also just be occur after it happens. So the market for asphalt, right? Like that you patch roads with, right? What do you think is something that might impact that market that is hard to predict year to year? Weather, right? This year, I would imagine if you need asphalt, the demand is probably relatively high, right? Because we had particularly kind of rough early winter so far. My guess is the roads are going to took a beat, right? And so sometimes weather can be one of those things that shifts our demand curve that's hard to predict. Sometimes it's just something specific to a good, right? Maybe it's a celebrity endorsement, right? That can cause a shift in our demand. We don't focus on those because we like to talk more about the generalized things that shift demand. These are going to be things that are kind of hard to target, okay? But they still exist, so I mentioned them here. I didn't get to this with my other class. So we'll stop here for the sake of time. I think we'll talk a little bit more about taxes and subsidies in the next class. You'll see, I tried to spend a little more time today setting us up. I will probably move a lot quicker, especially the first half of next class when we're talking about supply, because I've tried to really build up a lot of the concepts that will carry over from demand to supply. We'll probably go through pretty quick initially, but I think we'll save this for next class if we have time on it, okay? So what I did want to make sure we do today is hopefully this should be showing up on the homepage. This quiz for 1-28, right? So it's got a set of 3 questions. I think what I have according to the syllabus now, instead of doing like these questions I found a way to make it so I don't have to have a question where you click on participation point and then someone inevitably forgets to do that and has to email me. Now it's like already baked into these problems. So even if you get it wrong, it'll give you half credit just for answering. So we've got 3 questions. I'll be kind of nice. This is where like I'm usually pretty nice. So walk through them. It'll also save us a little bit of time. There's something we didn't quite cover last week that I want to make sure we cover today. Okay. So if I have ramen noodles and I have this inferior product, okay? So it's an inferior good. I have a decrease in my income, right? So for inferior products, I said you can think of these as like low quality goods. What I would do, anytime I like give you examples for something, think of an example that makes sense to you. So think of something in your life that would be an inferior good for you. That if you had more money, you would definitely stop buying it and start buying, like, substitute towards something else. So if it's ramen noodles to you, it's ramen noodles, right? If it's relying on public transportation is a good example. So if you had less income, that means for inferior goods, you're actually going to demand what? More or less of it? More. If I have lower income, I might have to start relying on these things I don't really want to buy, but because I have low income, I'm kind of forced. I don't really want to rent a shitty apartment, but I don't have enough money to buy my own house, right? So this is the idea that when I see decrease in income for inferior goods, I'll actually demand more of that product. So when I say demand more, that's a demand increase. I said one way you can think about increases and decreases. This point here is the origin or 0, right? So increases in demand would be moving further away from that point of 0. So what does an increase in demand look like? Not this. Right? This is actually getting closer to that 0 point. Leftward shifts are decreases in demand. An increase in demand is actually going to be this rightward shift in my demand curve. Okay? So for inferior products, when income goes down, I'm actually going to buy more of them, or we see a demand increase, regardless of the price, right? Holding constant the price, the fact that I have lower income for inferior goods, I'm now going to demand more of them. Okay? Any questions on that idea? Are we getting the quiz opened up okay? Yes? Okay. So, second question, right? What if I had ramen noodles and I see the price of ramen noodles decreases? Right? Well, I'm now looking at a specific good, ramen noodles, and the price of that good is changing. So am I going to have an increase or decrease in my demand? Be careful. When we draw these shifts in demand, these were other things that change, holding constant the price of that good. So this is changes in income, price expectations, substitute, complementary good changes, price changes. But when the price of the actual good changes, that's what we were holding constant to analyze all these other shifts. When the price of the good you're looking at changes, you don't see a shift in the demand curve. You're just moving to a different point on that demand curve, right? The price of the good and the quantity demand of the good you're looking at, that's what our demand curve told us the relationship between those two things. That was grammatically terrible the way I just said that, but the demand curve represented the relationship between changes in the price and the quantity demand of that good. That was better. So here we would just be moving to different points on our demand curve or C. Okay. Any questions? I think I changed it to 45. Does it still show up to 40 to you guys?
Not loaded.
All right, let me see. Let me double check. Oh, I meant for it to be 1050. Is it set at 40? No, it's set to be 1050. Yeah. So it's hopefully over the next couple minutes, it'll kind of load for you. And we'll just that's why I'm kind of going through it, kind of walking through a little bit slowly here. Oh, that's not what I wanted. All right. You say, I thought I had it set to be the end of class just to give us time. There we go. How many people are having issues with it getting loaded? A handful. All right, so hopefully over the next 5 to 10 minutes, like I said, it'll kind of get loaded up. We've already kind of went through the answers. So it should be pretty easy once it kind of gets popped up, get those recorded and submitted, okay? All right. So third question we have here is we've got an example we're thinking about substitute goods, okay? So I chose kind of SpaghettiOs, which if you don't know what those are, they're like some canned noodles with tomato sauce, right? So if I have a substitute good and the price of that substitute good decreases, am I going to be more or less likely to buy that substitute good? More likely, but I'm not thinking about the demand for that good. I'm thinking about the demand for what didn't have a price change, right? Ramen noodles. So when SpaghettiOs become cheaper, the demand for ramen noodles, if more people are going to be more likely to buy SpaghettiOs instead of ramen noodles, at any price, my demand for ramen noodles should decrease, right? Decreases in demand are going to be represented by what? Leftward shifts. Okay? So, like I said, hopefully I'm going to leave this open so you can kind of load this up. We've got the 3 answers kind of already worked through. Make sure you're getting that submitted before you leave today at 11. Now, we're not quite done. We've got one more thing I'm going to go through, but just to kind of give us some buffer time, I wanted to make sure that everyone can get that up or get that quiz loaded up and get it submitted before we leave today. Okay. So the other thing that we didn't quite cover last week, we ended, I had it in the slides. This was the question I gave you 0 points for on the quiz. Right? Was this idea of thinking about growth rates. So this is one thing about an economy as a whole. We want to invest in the capital goods because that's going to help cause increases in our growth rate as opposed to just consumption goods, right? If our entire economy just buys food, doesn't do much for us. Now, if we invest in the things like infrastructure, technology projects, we're going to be able to buy even more food tomorrow, right? If we just only buy food, we're just going to keep having the same amount year after year after year. We're not developing any new technologies. We're not growing. So if I take my current level of GDP, my current like value of resources, I can figure out what my new GDP would be in the future by taking my current GDP, multiplying it by 1 plus whatever growth rate I'm targeting. So this growth rate would be like 3, 4, 5%. We'll use the decimal form. So 0.03, 0.04, 0.05, 3, 4, 5%. And then take it to the power of however many years out I'm trying to predict or project what my new GDP will be. Okay. So this is really just a matter of like plugging and chugging. I don't focus a lot. That's why I wasn't super concerned we didn't get to at the end of last week. It might not be as important for the exam, but I also like to bring in some examples that you would see kind of in the next level. So like 252, which is what most of you have to take, you would start to play around with things like this. I also have an Excel file kind of linked. And I think originally it had started out as 1. So I just wanted to use this. Like, hopefully this has, I try to give you things that I think might have some personal value to your lives as well, not just like how to do well on the test. So the same thing that we talk about with like predicting new GDP based on old GDP and growth rates. It's the same thing for thinking about how much you'll pay on a loan for different interest rates, right? And what's the total value? So if I take out a $10,000 loan, but I've got a 5% interest rate, how much am I going to have to actually pay if I don't pay it off, until I get done with college, right? So just to kind of highlight why growth rates matter, let's say I had a GDP or a loan of $1, right? Just to kind of keep it nice and easy. Well, I can see that even small changes in the interest rate, or I can think about this also as in my GDP example, this would be like my growth rate. So going from 2 to 4%, or even if I think about like taking out a home loan, going from a 2 to 4% interest rate. If I have that loan, let's say for the next 35 years, what's the total value of that loan? 2 versus 4, it's nearly doubled in size, right? So my interest rate might seem like a small difference, 2 to 4%, but I'm going to end up paying twice as much over the next 35 years. And yet, okay, 2 versus $4, if I'm taking out a $1 loan, that doesn't matter much. But even on like a $10,000 loan, that difference is going to be what? $20,000. That's double the value of the loan, additional amount I'm gonna have to pay, right? So this, I don't know, I built this table out to kind of really show like compound interest really matters, right? And in fact, even at relatively low amounts, right? I mean, you can see here, like, if I have a 10% growth, within a year, it's growing pretty quick, right? But from year 0 to 1, it goes up by 100. From year 1 to 2, it would go up by 110. And then it goes up by 120. And then 100, right? So this compounding interest idea, the same thing would apply to like compounding GDPs. So what do countries really like? Instead of high interest rates, really high growth rates, right? That way we can ensure that year after year, we're increasing our GDP or the amount of available resources we have by even more, right? So I think we're set to be done at 10:50. I have that quiz set to be due at 10:50. So did anyone not able to get that submitted who was here today? Everyone was able to get it loaded up perfectly. So if ever we're doing these quizzes, I keep in mind like they load kind of slow. I'll give you time to either work on them today. It was nice and kind of work on them together. Other than that, we'll kind of pick up, work on supply, equilibrium, next class on Thursday, office hours tomorrow. Any other questions? Feel free to come up after class. All right, I will see you guys on Thursday.